If you've ever had an E30 before, you might be pretty used to having oil stains all over your driveway. This thing's got a terrible oil leak coming from the oil pan and the valve cover. So today I'm going to be fixing both the valve cover and the oil pan oil leak. I'm going to be resealing both, and I'm not going to be dropping the subframe. So if you want to learn how to do that, stay tuned.
Start by removing the four 10mm bolts holding this bracket to the valve cover. Then disconnect these two wire connectors and tuck them out of the way. Loosen the clamp for the IAC hose, remove the two bolts of the bracket and wiggle it off the hose and set it aside. Remove the 8 10mm nuts securing the valve cover to the cylinder head. Then loosen the clamp for the breather hose and remove it from the valve cover. Carefully maneuver the cover off and remove the old gasket.
You really want to make sure that this surface area is going to be very clean before we lay down the new gasket to prevent any additional oil leaks from happening. I'm also going to be adding a little bit of gray RTV on these cam seals. Since I'm not going to be replacing these, I want to prevent any oil leaks possible. Before we reinstall the valve cover, I'm going to clean all the remaining residue from the last gasket. With a X-Acto knife. You can do this with a razor blade. And then I'm gonna hit it with brake clean just to wipe down the top surface. Then we're gonna add the Permatex Gray RTV on the mating surface, just a little bit, very thin coat. Then we're gonna reinstall it on the cylinder head and start torquing it down. Now that we got the cover on and completely flat against the gasket, it's time to resecure everything, put all the hardware back on, and start putting it back together. It's important not to use power tools for tightening these bolts as it goes back together, since you can over tighten it. So I'm just going to do everything by hand. Now it's time to focus on my big oil leak, which is the oil pan. The gap in between the oil pan and the block, the gasket seems to have been blown out. So I'm dropping the pan either way. Let's get started.
Start by removing the 17mm drain plug from the oil pan to drain all of the oil from the engine.
Don't do that.
In my case, this car is turbocharged, so I'll have to remove the turbo drain hose from the fitting that's on the oil pan. Your car will likely not have this fitting or this hose. Now it's time to install the engine support bar that I got from Harbor Freight. I chose to go this route rather than using a jack to lift from the bell housing, because I wanted to make sure I had as much space under the car as possible.
So how this works is there's two stands. You put it on the edge where the fender meets against the chassis, and there's pads there to keep it from getting damaged. So there's 2 stands and then 1 main beam that holds way more than 1,000 pounds. And then there's a adjustable height like hook. It just loops through the factory engine lift mount. I'm not gonna twist it just yet because that's gonna force the engine to go upwards. I'm gonna loosen the motor mounts below first, and then I'm gonna start cranking this, and that's gonna slowly lift the engine up away from the subframe so I can make space to pull the oil pan out later. Now there's multiple ways of removing the oil pan from this car. The way that I'm doing it, I do not have to lower the subframe or disconnect the steering gear shaft, which I prefer not to mess with the steering rack or the steering column or the subframe anyway. So instead, I'm just lifting the motor just enough to slide the pan out of the way. So next steps are going to be to remove the ground strap from the oil pan and start removing the hardware, disconnect the motor mounts from the bottom, and lifting the motor. So this is how much we lifted it. See the little gap between the subframe and the motor mount. Hopefully that's enough space for me to pull the oil pan down and pull it forward.
You have to remove this metal cover from in front of the transmission bell housing in order to access the rear bolts of the oil pan.
This sensor disconnected, just pulls right off of this. Ground strap out of the way, all the hardware's been removed, the oil pan's ready to come out. This is exactly what I was talking about. You want to create enough space for you to be able to pull the oil pan down and forward. But before we do that, I gotta unbolt the oil pump from the cast iron block. So it's 1, 2, and 3 13mm bolts. So we're gonna unbolt that while the pan's in place, and then we're gonna drop the pan with the pump together and pull forward. Very glad I decided to do this because the old gasket was clearly leaking. It's just crumbling apart, cracking together like that, seeping out of here and there.
You have to remove the shaft that drives the oil pump from the block. Just wiggle the oil pump downwards and the shaft will eventually let go. Before we can install this brand new oil pan gasket, we must scrape off all gasket material from the oil pan. I also sprayed it with some brake clean and wiped down the surface. To ensure as much of a clean surface as possible, you want a smooth, flat surface to mate against the gasket. I absolutely hate oil leaks, so I even added gray RTV on the mating surface to ensure no leaks from under the gasket. Make sure the gasket is perfectly centered on the oil pan, and then set it aside while we clean the bottom side of the engine block. I found the easiest method to be using a flat razor blade to go under the gasket and just taking your time, taking big chunks off, rather than trying to rush it and doing little bits at a time. You also want to scrape off any old RTV from where the aluminum meets against the cast iron block. I also applied a very thin coat of gray RTV on the bottom surface of the engine block. Carefully maneuver the oil pan with the oil pump inside it back to its original position. Locate the hole where the oil pump drive shaft goes so you can line up the pump and bolt it back in place. There should be one 13mm bolt on the driver's side and two 13mm bolts on the passenger side. Raise the oil pan back to its original position and start partially screwing in the 10mm bolts in place, switching from one side to the other. No need to tighten anything yet, the main focus is getting the pan to sit flat against the block. There should be a total of 26 10mm bolts for the oil pan. Once you have all the hardware in place and the oil pan fully seated against the block, you can start torquing each one individually by hand. You do not want to do this with an impact wrench or any power tools because you could potentially over tighten it and damage the cork gasket. You can now lower the engine back down so it sits on the engine mounts. You can also remove the engine support bar from the engine bay. Once you've confirmed that the engine is seated properly, you can reinstall the hardware for the engine mounts, torque them back, reconnect the oil level sending unit, and reinstall the factory ground strap to the oil pan. Since I was already doing all this work to fix oil leaks, I decided to partially remove the turbo oil drain fitting and add some sealant to the threads to prevent chances of it leaking in the future. I suggest thoroughly cleaning all the parts removed prior to reinstallation. It would make it easier to tell if there are any lingering oil leaks after the repair. Don't forget to reinstall the aluminum cover between the bell housing and the oil pan. Reinstall the oil drain plug with a brand new washer and let the car sit for 12 hours to let the RTV fully cure before adding oil back into the engine. Let the engine run for at least 10 minutes and continue to observe for any residual oil leaks under the vehicle.
If you found today's video to be helpful or useful in any way, do me a favor and hit that like button. Definitely helps this channel out. And if you want to keep up with my projects such as this BMW, this Subaru, or my Lotus, consider subscribing to my channel. But for today, this is going to be it. Thank you for watching.